All right, I've got the right presentation. I've got the green light. We are all set. So I would say that these slides are already uploaded to Fast Wonder Blog if you want to click on them and download them. They may or may not be. I may have uploaded last year's slides because those are the ones I was just displaying. So somebody can go to the blog and tell me whether I uploaded the right slides or not. If they're not the right ones, I promise to upload them shortly. And they're on the speaking page. So the premise of this talk is that power imbalances are everywhere, including our open source projects. So this talk is going to talk about how rug pulls and forks and relicensing shift the power dynamics between cloud providers, open source companies, contributors, and users, along with how we can make better decisions about which open source projects we decide to embrace. And there are loads of links on the slides, which is why I have and/or will upload the correct version of them shortly. It is correct on the website. Whew. Okay. It's on fastwonderblog.com, and if you click on the speaking page, there is a link to these slides. I did want to just very quickly thank the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. So they provide funding for the Chaos Data Science Initiative, which is what I work on, along with the Linux Foundation and Ford Foundation, because they also provide loads of lovely support for the Chaos project. And I wanted to thank Matt Germonprey, who's been working with me on some of this research that's part of this presentation. He's also my co-author for a paper that we're working on related to this topic. So, look for that in 3 to 5 years, I guess, is the way academic publishing works. So I'm not going to go into a ton of detail about me. You can read my bio on the website. I have been in the technology industry for about 30 years, working mostly on open source. I'm a board member of Open UK. I'm deeply involved in the Chaos project, where I spend a lot of time thinking about how people can use metrics to understand how to measure and make improvements to open source project health and sustainability. So today I'm going to talk about how the power dynamics in open source have been changing with the proliferation of cloud computing and large cloud providers, along with how those power dynamics change during rug pulls, forks, other disruptions. And then I'll dive a bit deeper into the different types of rug pulls and their outcomes, including a whole bunch of data about relicensed projects and their forks. And then finally, I'll talk more about what we can do when we're selecting open source projects to minimize our risk and reduce our disruptions to our work. So we'll start with a bit of history. Since really probably the beginning of time, those in power have been able to use that power against the weak, often with very little recourse, frankly. A well-known example can be seen in feudalism, where you have a powerful ruling class which controlled the land, leading to oppression and exploitation of the people actually doing the hard work of farming and protecting that land. Now, in this scenario, the power was mostly consolidated in the hands of a few, with the king and the church as the ones with the most power on the top of this pyramid. And much of this power was delegated then to nobles and lords who administered the land and often provided protection in the form of military services. But they served under the king, who could then take away that power. And these lords and nobles then held power over the peasants, who worked the land and had very little power or autonomy, despite doing, let's face it, most of the real work. Now, the lines are a little fuzzier, the consequences less extreme, but with the rise in popularity of large cloud providers, the open source power dynamics are looking a little similar to that feudalism example. But in our case, we do have ways to flip those power dynamics, which I'll talk about throughout the presentation. But here at the top, we have the cloud providers. So with many of our applications moving into the cloud, it is super easy to just use many of the services provided by those cloud providers, right? If you need some piece of open source software, you can pretty easily go to any of these major cloud providers, AWS, Microsoft, and they probably have a service that you can use to easily create it. And in many cases, they offer services for open source projects, while sometimes contributing or sometimes not much of anything back to these projects, which of course tends to upset some of the smaller companies in the next tier who have less power than those big cloud providers. In some, but not all of those cases, those smaller cloud providers, those smaller companies might have the power to relicense an open source project, which can then flip the balance of power between that smaller company and the large cloud provider. But this power play from the smaller companies then puts those maintainers, contributors, and users in a position of even less power and creates friction around this project that was just relicensed. Within open source projects, those with the least amount of power can then fork the project to, again, flip the power dynamics. But this is a lot of work to fork a project, especially a large project, and it may or may not be successful. And one thing that makes these open source power dynamics a bit fuzzy is that many of these companies and their employees actually fit into multiple of these categories. So it's not cut and dry, right? So for example, cloud providers are also users, contributors, and maintainers of various open source projects. And I'll talk more about this when we talk about the forks. So rug pulls, this is just like it sounds. I'm gonna knock this off if I don't move it, since I'm going to continue to talk with my hands. So this is just like it sounds. Companies pull the rug out from under the rest of us when they use open source to build a user base and a community before making a power play and doing something like relicensing or otherwise disrupting the project. Open source projects that are controlled by a single company have a higher risk of disruptions over the longer term because they operate at the whims of that company holding the power. And there's little recourse for outside contributors or users with less power when that company decides to go in a direction that maybe doesn't align with the expectations of all of the other participants within the community. And for company-originated open source projects, you can consider the reputation of that company as a steward of open source projects. However, while you might consider, you might think that a company is really an excellent open source citizen. They're awesome. Their projects are not likely to be relicensed or forked. But keep in mind that companies can change direction with little to no notice. And you never know when they might be acquired by a company that isn't so awesome and open source friendly. And there's absolutely nothing you can do about that. And companies just change their strategy at some later date, right? And it's possible companies just go out of business. This happens, and they abandon their open source projects. But projects are much less likely to be disrupted by rug pulls if they're under neutral, well-run foundations, because those foundations encourage governance structures that provide a level playing field where people from a whole bunch of different companies can all work together as equals to create something that benefits everyone, which I'll talk more about later. Now, as I mentioned, the power dynamics are a little more complicated than the pyramid diagram that I showed earlier, because companies also need to answer to their investors, their boards, other stakeholders that are in a position of power over that company, whether it's a small company or one of those very large cloud providers. And lately, some companies have experienced a lot of pressure from VCs, shareholders, other investors to relicense their open source projects to generate more license revenue, especially when a vendor's revenue streams rely solely or maybe mostly on an open source project. Their investors and shareholders can become concerned that the vendor is not making as much profit as possible from the project. And this is compounded if other companies, often large cloud providers, are competing for those same customers and profiting from the open source project that vendor has put substantial resources into developing. And these concerns about profitability lead to pressure from the investors to put the open source project under a new license with more restrictions than what would be possible if they left it under the original open source license. And these restrictions often make it more difficult for cloud providers and other companies to profit from newly relicensed open source projects. In several of the high-profile relicensing relicensing events like the ones from Redis and Elastic, in the relicensing announcement, they mentioned that they were finding it difficult to sustain the company while the cloud providers were profiting from the work and taking business away from that smaller company that was driving that open source project. So this flips the power dynamic and increases the power associated with these smaller companies while decreasing the power of the cloud providers. But of course, that is not the end of the power dynamic flip, which you'll see when I talk about forks. So the disruptions caused by rug pulls can result in forks. But we're going to take just a little side quest for a quick overview of what I mean when I talk about forking. So in the days before GitHub, forks usually referred to hard forks. They're sometimes called hostile forks. They're sometimes called variant forks. And these hard forks are created with the purpose of starting some new branch of development, which then diverges from the original and often competes with the original project under a new governance model for the fork. Now, hard forks are in contrast to the social forks popularized by GitHub, which are a completely different thing. But these are on GitHub when you click the fork button on that repo. So those social forks are often used for collaboration, not competition. They're used for collaboration while contributing to the original project, usually using a pull request or something similar. So I'm focused on hard forks. So throughout this presentation, I'm not talking about clicking that fork button on GitHub. So all references are going to be to hard forks, except near the end where I have one slide about GitHub stars and forks. So just keep that in mind as we work our way through the presentation. So these hard forks are a form of collective action that flips the power dynamics in the pyramid and allows those of us with less power to take control of our own destiny by taking back control of our open source projects in the form of a fork, where we control the governance of this newly formed project. However, it's just not as simple as that, right? Nothing's that simple. Forks are hard work. So you often hear people say, well, anyone can fork a project and run with it. Yes, that is true, but it takes a significant amount of people and resources to make these projects successful over time. And let's face it, often those people and resources are often provided by very large companies, especially in some of the forks that we'll see later. So I mentioned that a smaller company can relicense an open source project and flip that power dynamic and gain power back from the cloud providers. But the cloud providers can again flip the power dynamic by forking a project and gaining their power back from these smaller companies. And let's face it, this works pretty well because these big cloud providers can often devote a significant number of people and resources into making a fork successful. Okay, so now that we've seen the power dynamics, we're going to do a deeper dive into the rug pulls, including the forks and other disruptions that result from them. So you'll see how these play out in a few different scenarios. One of the most common rug pull methods over the past few years has been relicensing open source projects. The companies controlling these projects used open source to grow their user base. And as a way for those projects to become widely used and popular. Then they moved those projects under non-open source licenses. In these three cases, the result was collective action by users, and one case, contributors coming together to create a fork of the original project. So I'll talk about each of these examples on later slides, so I'm not going to cover them in detail here. But the important thing is to remember is that rug pulls are often related to relicensing, but they also have consequences in the form of the forks that result. Now, the research we've been doing within the Chaos project is focused on relicensing events that resulted in a fork of the original project. But it's important to remember that not all relicensing events and not all rug pulls result in a viable fork. And I'll admit that I haven't really spent any time looking into why some relicensing events result in popular forks and others don't. So I'm not going to go into much detail here, but it's important to remember that there are rug pulls that impact users and contributors that, for whatever reason, don't result in successful forks. Now, the Perforce Puppet rug pull is particularly interesting because it wasn't technically a relicense, but it effectively had the same result. So Perforce acquired Puppet back in 2022, and they announced on November 7th, 2024, that it was going to move binaries and packages developed by the team into a private location, which of course they claim is for security and stability reasons. Whatever. In the announcement, they spent quite a bit of time explaining how this was not a relicense, because there'd just been some of those and they didn't want to be lumped in, I think. But they also said that they were going to be slowing the frequency of source code contributions to the public repository. So they're effectively moving the development behind closed doors. So not a relicense per se, but as you can imagine, this did result in a fork called OpenVox, which Ben talked about yesterday. And in OpenVox, the users and contributors are taking the power back after that perforce rug pull. So the fork was announced in January, and I don't have any analysis of it yet, but I'll probably start digging into it soon, since it's been just over 6 months, so I should have enough data to have a look. Now, if you've ever heard me talk before, you've probably heard me say something about how open source projects are complex, and no two open source projects are exactly alike. So similarly, one trend you'll see throughout the rest of this presentation is that different types of open source projects experience different impacts depending on the situation surrounding the fork in the project. I'm not going to go into a ton of detail on this slide, but you can find all of the data that I'm going to talk about today in the CHAOSS repository linked on this slide. So we welcome any feedback and contributions. If you want to help us dig into the code and the data, it's all there for you to have a look at. And while the data is stored in GitHub using Jupyter Notebooks, it's really not that scary, and you don't need any data science skills or, frankly, even any programming skills to understand it. This is the thing I love about Jupyter Notebooks, is you can just ignore those code blocks that I use to generate the output and just look at the output to see the results. So it's relatively accessible to just about anybody to look at. I will also say that there's no perfect data to understand the impact that employees of particular organizations have in open source projects. So the goal of this research is not to have perfect data, but to get a feel for how employees of different organizations participate in these projects. And while it can be, let's face it, pretty difficult to gather data about where people work, I think I've come up with a reasonable solution by only gathering data about the most, what I'm calling, significant contributors. So those with 10 or more commits for the bigger projects, Elasticsearch and OpenSearch, and 5 or more commits for the smaller ones. And I was able to identify employers for most of those contributors, and I filled in some of the gaps by just talking to the people who contribute to those projects, which is always a good thing to do when you're doing research on projects. And so I used numbers of commits as a starting point for employer data from people who had 10 or more or 5 or more, depending on the project. But sometimes commits aren't a really good indicator of the amount of work. So I also looked at numbers of lines added and lines deleted to get a better feel for the magnitude. And I only focused on the primary repository for each of the projects. Now, organizational affiliation data is important when looking at relicensing and forks, so I started with that and then expanded it to look at stars and forks as a proxy for usage, which I'll talk about later. But there are loads of ways to contribute to open source, so the plan is also to look at some other metrics and other areas for these projects as we move forward. Now, let's talk about the examples. So Elastic moved Elasticsearch under the server-side public license, dual licensed with the Elastic license. So those are not OSI-approved open source licenses. So Elasticsearch was no longer an open source project in 2021 when they relicensed. So as you'll see on the next slide, almost all of the existing contributors to Elasticsearch were Elastic employees. So the relicense had very little impact on contributors, since there just weren't a lot of outside contributors. But there was a pretty big impact on some users of Elasticsearch who had to decide whether they could use it under one of these new proprietary licenses. And this resulted in a decision at Amazon, in Amazon AWS, to fork Elasticsearch into a new project called OpenSearch so that they could give their customers an alternative to Elasticsearch. So without a strong open source contributor community, there wasn't a strong contributor base to drive the fork. So while AWS did have a few people who had contributed to Elastic before, including Elasticsearch before, including one person who'd worked at Elastic, they were still kind of mostly starting from scratch with employees who were learning the code base. And so it took a little while to get something out. And as I've mentioned before, that's also very hard work. So in this example, I'm comparing the year before Elasticsearch originally relicensed. So during this first period, the project was still under the Apache 2.0 license. So in the second and third periods of time, the project was under the SSPL and Elastic license. So this is during the period when Elasticsearch was no longer an open source project. And you can see in the data that this just made very little difference, right? Because Elastic had never built a strong contributor base outside of the people who worked at the company. So in both time periods, Elastic employees were making 95, 97% of additions and deletions to the code base. And no more than 3 people from outside of Elastic made 10 or more commits in any given year. Now, it's not on this slide, but I also looked at 6 months after they added the AGPL. So 6 months after they became an open source project again, and there were actually no non-employees with 10 or more commits, which is not entirely surprising given that they didn't have people before contributing when they were an open source project. So I wouldn't have expected the AGPL to get them a whole bunch of new contributors, and indeed it did not. So OpenSearch. In this example, I'm comparing the early days of the OpenSearch fork, the first year with the most recent year, with an end date of when OpenSearch was moved from Amazon into the Linux Foundation, and then 6 months after the move to the LF. Now, I spent some time in the OpenSearch community shortly after the fork, and in that first year, a lot of work was being done within Amazon. So the code was public, but a lot of the discussions and decisions were actually happening within the company. So it's not surprising that we see here in the data that most of the contributions in that first time period were coming from Amazon employees. But in the more recent years, you can see that this has gradually shifted to bring in more contributors from outside of Amazon. And they've made a lot of improvements in their governance. And this is what allowed other people to contribute and then facilitated that move to the Linux Foundation, which I think is a great next step for OpenSearch. It's also worth noting that there's one individual from a company called Ivan that made a lot of the non-Amazon contributions in all of these time periods, but there were also loads of significant contributions from other people. So this is trending in the right direction from my perspective. However, I was surprised that there wasn't more of an uptick after the move to the LF. So this does suggest that starting a fork under a company and then moving it into a foundation doesn't have the same benefits as starting the fork under that foundation, which you'll see in the next couple of slides. In other words, I think OpenSearch would have been more successful if they had started it under a foundation, which is what I was pitching in the early days. But that took a few years because big companies. So let's talk about another example, Terraform, OpenTofu. So on the one hand, again, most Terraform contributions were being made by HashiCorp employees. So even when it was an open source project, from that standpoint, the original project is a little similar to Elasticsearch. However, you will see that the fork is very different than OpenSearch in certain ways, similar in others. So the OpenTofu fork was started under the Linux Foundation. So from the start, it was under a neutral foundation rather than being started by a single company. But in other ways, it looks a little bit like the OpenSearch fork because it was driven by users rather than people who'd been contributing to the original project. So let's have a look at the data. So similar to the Elasticsearch example, it's HashiCorp employees who are making the significant contributions to Terraform. So even before the relicensing, with only 1 to 2 people outside of the company making any significant contributions to that core repository. So it's not surprising that it's about the same after the relicense. Now, OpenTofu has contributors from a wide variety of companies, with Spacelift employees making the most significant contributions. However, it's interesting to note that none of these contributors contributed to Terraform before the fork. So, like with the OpenSearch example, these were contributors who had to learn the code base as they were forking the project. Which, again, super hard work. I talked to some of the people that were doing this, and they were like, yeah, it was way harder than we thought it was going to be. But they seem to be doing all right, so that's great. And so this is in contrast to Valkey, which we'll talk about soon, where over a dozen contributors moved to the fork. And there is also in all of these projects a lot of people who've made small contributions. So all of these projects have very long tails, as you expect from open source projects. So this is a very different example than the ones I just talked about. So in this case, there were a lot of contributors to Redis who weren't employees of Redis. Some of this is because early in the days of Redis, they had promised that they would never relicense. So there are blog posts from the founder of Redis that were like, yeah, we're never going to relicense. That's just not going to happen. That's not who we are. Things change. That person was not at the company, and Redis moved to some non-open source licenses. So when that happened, the contributors forked the project and started a new project called Valkey. So this new project was started from under the Linux Foundation. So again, from the start, it was under a neutral foundation rather than being started by a company. And even though Valkey is a relatively new project, it's, I think, the newest of all of these, you can already see how it's different than the previous examples. So this is where the Redis project differs from Elasticsearch and Terraform in the number of people who were contributing and were not employees of Redis. So in the year leading up to the relicense, while Redis was still open source, there were substantial contributions and maintainers from employees of other companies, with twice as many non-employees making 5 or more commits. So Redis employees made more additions and deletions, but these were actually, I went back and I looked at a few very large change sets that sort of inflated that number. And you can see that employees of other companies made almost twice as many commits from about a dozen people. So in the year after the relicense, all of those existing contributors from companies like Amazon, Alibaba, Tencent, Huawei, Ericsson, who contributed over 5 commits to the Redis project in the year leading up to the relicense, they stopped contributing. So some made a couple of commits shortly after the relicensing, which in talking to them was frankly just a work in progress that eventually got merged. But all of the contributors who made 5 or more commits after the relicense were Redis employees. Now, Valkey had 52 people employed at 13 companies in the first year of the fork, and 22 of those people had previously contributed to Redis and were now contributing to Valkey. And these are contributors from a variety of companies, with Amazon having the most contributors. The Google data is a little bit misleading. So while Google employees have made a very large percentage of additions and deletions, most of those changes can be attributed to 2 PRs, which related to formatting changes. So it's still significant and important, but that's why those numbers look a little weird. And there are also a lot of contributions coming from other companies, Alibaba, Ericsson, Samsung. Now, this is always the problem in open source. How do we know who uses our stuff, right? So it's very, very difficult to measure actual usage of an open source project. So Sophia Vargas, Georg Link, and a couple of other people have done some research that have found a strong positive correlation between usage and GitHub forks and stars. So this is not perfect. I'm only using it to highlight a few trends, and it is an indicator of usage, not proof of usage. But for each project that had a relicensing event, so Elasticsearch, Terraform, Redis, there was a temporary spike in GitHub forks right around the time of that event. Not surprising. This indicates that contributors or users wanted to keep a local copy of the source code as a response to that collective action threat. Shortly after the relicensing event, the number of new GitHub forks and stars were a slightly lower level than before for all of the relicensed projects, which indicates that slightly fewer people were interested in contributing and using these relicensed projects. And for each of the hard forks, there was also a pattern. They experienced a spike in the number of GitHub forks and stars shortly after the announcement of that fork, and then a reduced number in later months. And this demonstrates that during this period of uncertainty, people were considering that fork and as a possible response to this threat, or possible response to the relicensing. And when comparing the relicensed project with its hard fork, in all cases, the hard forks had fewer new GitHub forks compared to the original project. OpenSearch had fewer new stars than Elasticsearch, but the other hard forks that were started under foundations actually have more new stars than the original relicensed projects. So this data I think it says here, it's median new stars and forks per day. So these are new stars and forks per day is the numbers we're looking at. But all of this taken together, just looking at this big picture, indicates that both the original project and the hard forks continue to exist together, with both of the projects being used. However, the relicensed projects have reduced usage due to some users switching to those hard forks. And that's, again, more pronounced for the forks that were started under a foundation. So what can we do? These rug pulls and power dynamics create significant issues for those of us who use and contribute to these projects. As maintainers, contributors, and even users of open source, we devote our most precious resource to these projects, our time. And we need for projects that we spend time on to be sustainable over the long term to avoid wasting this very precious resource. And there's no way to predict which projects will be sustained over time versus ones that might experience a rug pull. But there are some warning signs and things to think about before spending too much time on a particular project. So before I start the slide, I'm going to say that I am not a lawyer. I am going to gloss over these details because you should talk to an actual lawyer who knows the ins and outs of open source licensing and legal agreements. But there are things that can increase or decrease the likelihood of a rug pull when a project is owned by a company. Contributor license agreements, CLAs, create a power imbalance within open source communities where the power is tilted toward the company who owns the project and controls that contributor license agreement, giving the company more power than the other contributors. So for example, the power to relicense a project in some cases. So when projects use CLAs, rug pulls are more common. It is worth mentioning Elasticsearch, Terraform, and Redis all had CLAs. So projects that use a developer certificate of origin, on the other hand, which is what the Linux kernel uses, along with lots of other projects, don't suffer from this type of power imbalance. So that's not to say that there might not be other types of rug pulls with projects using a DCO, but they aren't likely to result in a relicense. And the type of license used by a project might also influence certain types of rug pulls, but that's definitely a question for a lawyer, so I'm just going to move off before I get myself in trouble and move on to stuff I do know about. So I talked earlier about how rug pulls and power plays are more common when a project is controlled by a single company, as we just saw in several examples. So one way to make better use of our time is by supporting projects that are under neutral foundations whenever possible. So the CNCF, the Linux Foundation, Eclipse, Apache Software Foundation, these are all lovely neutral foundations. And projects are much less likely to experience rug pulls if they're under neutral, well-run foundations, because those foundations encourage governance structures that create a level playing field where people from a whole bunch of different companies can work together as equals to create something that benefits everyone. But it's not enough to just focus on projects that are under neutral foundations. You also need to look at project governance. So while it isn't very common, rug pulls can and do still happen to projects under neutral foundations, usually when all or most of the development is coming from the employees at a single company. So there are examples of these in most foundations. There was one example of this in the CNCF. There's a project called Cortex, which Grafana was driving most of the development. So they had control over the developers and the power to make unilateral decisions about what those developers work on. So they were making changes that they didn't want to relicense under the Apache 2.0, which is what Cortex was licensed under. So they forked Cortex. They basically forked the project that they had contributed to the CNCF and created Mimir as a new company-owned project, still open source, but now under the AGPL v3, which has very different restrictions than the Apache license. So it can help to look for neutral governance, where leadership positions and maintainers come from a variety of organizations with a fair and transparent process for selecting those leaders. And this creates a level playing field where we can all participate as equals when neutral governance is combined with neutral ownership of projects under foundations. Now, I talked about neutral governance, but we should also be thinking about contributor sustainability in general. Does the project have enough contributors to sustain it over time and replace the existing maintainers when they burn out or move on to something else? For the open source projects we rely on, are there enough contributors that if one of them retired on a beach tomorrow with no notice and didn't take their laptop with them, could the project continue with minimal disruptions? Now, this leads directly to how companies can help open source projects that are important to them. I've talked a lot about the power dynamics, but companies also have the power and resources to make real improvements. And corporate involvement can positively impact the sustainability of our open source projects, including the forks. Companies allocate employee time to contribute to projects, or they provide funding and other resources to help sustain open source projects. Having your employees working within a project helps you understand the power dynamics that might be at play and better understand the strengths and weaknesses of that project, while also being able to influence the project from within. Now, there are many other ways you can think about sustainability of a project and find ways to improve the sustainability from within for the projects that you use. So some of you may already be familiar with the Chaos Project. We have a series of project viability metrics, metrics models, actually, collections of metrics, which help you think about which projects you should spend time on and which ones maybe aren't going to be viable over the long term. So if you're deciding whether to embrace a project and want to dig into a lot more details than what I just talked about, that would be a good place to start. We also recently launched a practitioner guide series. So each guide is focused on a single topic. But despite Chaos being focused on metrics, the real value of these guides is not actually in the metrics, but in how to make meaningful improvements within open source projects across several key areas. So you see we have them on responsiveness, contributor sustainability, organizational participation, demonstrating value, diverse leadership. So we have lots of different guides. So if you're looking for additional ideas for improving your projects, it's a good place to start. And they are all MIT licensed, so you can just take them and you can actually fork the repo where the guides are and do whatever you'd like with them. So as we confirmed earlier, for those of you who are here at the beginning, these slides are actually uploaded to the speaking page on fastwonderblog.com, the correct version, which wasn't the version I started with in this presentation. So I'm not going to spend any more time on this, just mention that you have links to these resources. With the rise in popularity of cloud providers, the open source power dynamics are looking a little similar to that feudalism example that I talked about at the beginning of the presentation. But in our case, what's different is that we have the power to shift those power dynamics. A smaller company deciding to move a project from an open source license can flip the power dynamic and can gain power back from these large cloud providers. But they also shift the balance of power further away from the contributors and the users at the bottom of that pyramid. This encourages those who now have less power to take collective action to fork a project, which again flips that power dynamic in favor of the contributors and the users. Again, often including cloud providers as users. So within the open source world, we are definitely better off than those peasants and those serfs, because we have certain freedoms, right, that allow us to take collective action to gain power back by forking projects when others abuse their power. With that, thank you, and we'll open it up to questions. Questions?
For you. So in your, I want to think or ask you to think a little bit or talk a little bit more across the data and the interpretation. Like I think you've got this, strong interpretation that shifting to neutral foundations sets the stage for kind of, more like viable forks down the road, and then some kind of strategic suggestions to, for example, for companies to invest more before the fork happens, if you're actually dependent on a tool, which makes a lot of sense. I guess the question is, from your data, I almost wanted more signal of that in the data, right? Like I think it's like there are hints of it, But I was curious what other differences maybe you observed across the projects where there is growth afterwards, right? Like, so for example, I think you talked about how, I forget the ordering, but the third fork,
Redis and Valkey.
Yeah, it was Redis and Valkey. There was more distributed contribution beforehand.
Mm-hmm.
And so it basically made it so that the fork, like, yeah, sure, go ahead. You want to go off and go fork this, have fun. The rest of us are going to go start a new sandbox, and it's going to survive. How much of the, like, are there other explanations that you considered, that you, like, looked at? Are there other elements of, like, the social dynamics within the communities that might shape the outcomes for these forks, right? I guess I'm just trying to push a little bit on the neutral foundation as the answer part of this, to understand more deeply what other factors might be explanatory.
Yeah. Okay. So the question was, I would like to see more data, and are there other explanations beyond neutral foundations? The answer to that is most certainly, probably yes. Most certainly, probably, probably yes. So that is the next phase of this research. So the plan was to start with organizational participation, because that's a very important piece of looking at relicensing and forks in particular. So the idea was to start with that, and then, oops. This is on wheels. And then, so don't lean. And then take it and look at other project health metrics, and look at other parts of the community, and look at other things going on. Because it isn't all about the neutral foundations. That is one element of it. There are certainly other things going on in these projects that we haven't dug into yet, because frankly, it's a very complex space. And looking at the relicensed projects and looking at their forks, you have to kind of look at different measures because of the dynamics that were in these communities. So we're trying to figure out what we want to look at next. Is the short answer.
Thanks.
I have
Yeah.
a question.
Yeah.
Not to, usurp moderator privileges or something. I noticed in the timelines that you put on the screen that a number of the timelines between the announcement of relicensing and the announcement of the fork is actually pretty short. Big companies do take a long time, but most collective action movements can't even get out of bed in 2 weeks. So to launch a new fork in 2 weeks seems like a miracle. Was it your sense that a single devoted person was changing the world in those cases, and they were like, we're going to storm the barricades, follow me? Or was that everybody knew it was coming and they were waiting? Or give us maybe a little bit more insight into what that collective action movement looks like.
Yes, and it's very different for each of the projects, which is what's particularly interesting. So in the example of Elasticsearch and OpenSearch, there were clearly communication happening between Elastic and Amazon AWS, because the originating date of that. So none of these. Let me just. This is just a data point here. None of these forks were created by clicking that fork button on GitHub. They were all cloned and then re-uploaded to a brand new repository. So the date of the creation of the OpenSearch repository predates the Elasticsearch announcement of the relicense. So there was obviously some communication happening. People at Amazon were concerned that Elastic was going to relicense. They probably had a heads up. There was probably some internal company back and forth, because these two companies have important partnerships, right? So there was something going on before. In the case of Valkey, it was primarily driven by a couple of the maintainers, so people like Madeline Olson, who Redis said they were going to relicense, and so there was an immediate, we're going to clone that particular point in time, and we're going to fork it. The OpenTofu thing was a little bit different because there was a big push to get HashiCorp to change their mind. So there was a manifesto, there were signatures on the manifesto, there were a whole bunch of people that were like, hey, please don't do this. These are a whole bunch of your customers. We would like for you not to do this, please. And they were not successful at that. So then that one was also then announced. But there was a bigger delay in that one than some of the others. Yeah.
I could tell you a little bit about what happened with OpenBox. We, my co-founder and I didn't have any inside news, but we kind of saw the writing on the wall, and so we did all the work ahead of time. When the fork was announced and they pulled packages and everything, we republished packages the day after. And it wasn't like we just like magically did it all at once.
Wait, you saw writing on the wall. What writing on what wall?
So it's 12:30.
So yeah. So decreases in contribution from the company would be a signal. I think we're out of time.
Back at 2:00 for even more